Good evening and welcome to the Big Dialogues at the Princess Theatre. Thank you all for coming. Here we all are again to prove that it is possible to have civil, productive, even enjoyable and enlightening public discussions on difficult, complex topics like pandemic management. Now to introduce myself, I'm your MC, Christy Johns, a media communications professional, here to introduce you to tonight's topic. How should we manage the next pandemic? The pandemic exposed many fault lines in society. Many people feel strongly about what happened from many different perspectives and experiences. They were draconian restrictions that ruined lives, some people say. Others say it was to keep everyone safe, and we saved so many lives by locking down. I often think COVID is like an invisible bomb site. It's gone off, and now we're just looking around, picking up the pieces. Whatever your journey was through COVID, and in the aftermath, if that's what this is, I hope you're all well, and I do wonder if you do things differently next time around. I don't purport to be any type of leader, but I'm really interested in people's views, and I wish I could hear them all to make an accurate assessment of what has just gone on. Of course, we don't have time to hear everyone's views, but we will hear a wide range of views from our amazing panellists tonight, with questions from the audience as far as the time permits. And because the pandemic has had such devastating impacts on so many people and society at large, passions can run high. So this is a good time to restate the Brisbane rule created at the launch of the Brisbane Dialogues as a calming background to tonight's discussion. All participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, concentrate on the content of discussions, not on the characters, before, during and afterwards, online as well as offline. Now to housekeeping. Mobile phones on silent, please. Fire exits are obvious. Feel free to move around as unobtrusively as possible during the discussion if you need to, and those at tables can keep ordering food and drinks via the QR codes on your tables. Mobile phones on silent, and that's it. It is customary at Big Dialogues to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather by referring to a principle or feature of dialogue in Aboriginal culture. So I'd like to go right back to the first one. For important discussions, sit together around the campfire or under a tree. That is, in a congenial place, conducive to good discussion. On behalf of all present, I'd like to acknowledge both the traditional custodians of the stewardship of the land and the tradition of dialogue which jointly underpin what we are doing tonight, as well as the current custodians, the owners and management of the Princess Theatre and its sister over the river, the Tivoli, who so generously provide these congenial places for our purpose and our enjoyment. We also acknowledge and thank our first financial sponsors, Griffith University and the Andrew N. Liveris Academy for innovation and leadership at the top level, and the UQ Postgraduate Association at the lower level. Their tangible votes of support for our mission are greatly appreciated and will make a significant difference to what the Brisbane Dialogues, or TBD, can achieve in 2023. And of course, a huge thanks, as always, to the small band of volunteers and many others who, in numerous ways, enable it all to happen. Thank you. TBD is Australia's first dedicated civil discourse organisation and arguably the only truly independent, non-parochial, neutral forum for public and private discussion of big ideas and issues, at least in Queensland. We are always looking for volunteers and donations, so please help wherever you can. All our activities to date, Big Dialogues, First Tuesday Club, Queensland Talks, are self-supporting thanks to volunteer labour and in-kind sponsors, and of course, paying guests. The success of the inaugural round of Dialogues at School is the trigger to raise money. About $200,000 is needed to expand the program nationally next year, to do it well and promote the principles and practice of dialogue in the next generation. Look out for a paid membership program in the new year. Donations, offers and introductions of moderators, sponsors and philanthropists are very welcome. We are also very glad to be collaborating again with the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences and are grateful for all their help. The Academy exists to promote excellence in the arts and sciences, to stimulate activity in those areas that lie on the intersection between disciplines, and to provide independent scholarship and advice for social and public policy. Carrying on from tonight's discussion, Queensland Academy will be conducting a series of roundtables early next year to go into more depth on the many different dimensions of pandemic management, and will be writing a substantial report to be presented to policymakers. Now, before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everyone to text questions to the number you can see on the screen from time to time. It is 0439 209 215. Good, succinct questions with names given may be used later in the discussion. Feel free to send comments and feedback also, which you can also do via the printed brochures or the website accessed by the QR code. Okay, now to introduce the speakers for tonight. First, introducing Gigi Foster, Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales, author of the Voices Against Lockdown newsletter, and co-author of 2 books on the pandemic, The Great COVID Panic and Do Lockdowns and Border Closures Serve the Greater Good? Please give a warm welcome to Gigi. Next, we have Paul Griffin, Director of Infectious Diseases at Mater Health Services, Associate Professor at University of Queensland School of Medicine, Medical Director at Nucleus Network, and frequent media contributor on the pandemic. Welcome, Paul. Paul Harris, Advisory Board Member at Global Infrastructure Partners and formerly Chairman of the Productivity Commission and CEO of National COVID-19 Commission Advisory Board. Welcome, Peter. Next, we have Isabel Marshall, Young Australian of the Year in 2021, a medical student at the University of Adelaide, social entrepreneur and member of the Independent Inquiry into Australia's COVID-19 response. And last, but certainly not least, our moderator for tonight, Peter Varghese, Chancellor of the University of Queensland and also a member of a philanthropy-funded independent inquiry into Australia's COVID-19 response. Welcome, Peter, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christy, and good evening to everyone. Can I say how delighted I am to be here and to be able to moderate what I fully expect will be a very interesting discussion given the expertise and the standing of our panel members. So in the discussion tonight, we want to try and be true to the founding principles of the Brisbane Dialogues, which is to engage in civil discourse, to debate issues, debate them quite robustly, but also to look for common ground, even if we have very different perspectives. That great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, argued that the only way you can begin to push out the boundaries of knowledge is to falsify what you believe to be true. So we may think that all swans are white until we encounter a black swan. Now, mind you, if you're from WA, you would have reached that conclusion much earlier than anybody else. But beyond testing our assumptions, we want tonight to also find the connecting thread across the past, the present, and the future when it comes to dealing with the next pandemic. And having already made a rather pompous reference to a great philosopher, let me add another one, and that is that Edmund Burke once said that government was a contract across generations, linking the past, the present, and the future. And I think the same can really be said about public policy making, which is going to be one of the focuses for this evening. So we do want our discussion to focus on the future, but to learn the lessons from our recent COVID experience is important because it will help us better to manage what happens when the next pandemic comes. To prepare for the future, we obviously must understand the past. Now, I fully expect that much of what we will discuss this evening is with the wisdom of hindsight. And I think it's important to put that into some perspective, because hindsight is often dismissed as armchair pontification, but the truth is it's nothing more than learning lessons from the past. So to the extent that we reach back over the last almost 3 years, it's not to assign blame or to second guess decisions that were made in a fog of uncertainty, but I hope to actually gain a measure of humility about both what we got right and what we need to do differently next time. Now, the format of our discussions is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make some opening remarks for about 5 minutes on whatever issues they wish to emphasize at the start of our discussion. I'll then put some specific and different questions to each panelist and use that as a basis for having a broader discussion. And towards the end, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience before we conclude the evening. So let me start in the alphabetical order that everyone is seated, and over to you, Gigi.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's such a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful venue and talking about what I think is mostly accepted now to be one of the most extreme policymaking eras in Australian history, with multiple people with different views in the room. So I think that's just fabulous. Thank you to the Brisbane Dialogues for doing this. So my view of what happened in the last 2+ years, 3+, maybe almost 3 years, is that we entered a phase where we forgot many things very quickly. And I have a list here of what we forgot. We forgot the prior plans we had made here in Australia and elsewhere for how to manage respiratory pandemics, which never included locking down whole healthy populations. We forgot the role of immune support, prevention, and early treatment in managing any disease, certainly a respiratory illness. We forgot that hospitals in normal flu seasons sometimes do get overrun. Otherwise, we would have too many hospitals. We forgot the role of natural immunity, the processes by which natural immunity can deliver protection against diseases. We forgot that risks and health concerns are heterogeneous across people rather than being the same for all people. We forgot how to achieve total human health and total human well-being, narrowing those concepts to being just about COVID. We forgot that masks of the sort that are worn in surgical theaters are basically useless to protect people against transmission of respiratory diseases. We forgot that PCR tests cannot be used to diagnose a disease. And on the economic side, as an economist, I must say, we forgot the economic impact of money printing that is not commensurate with increases in economic productive activities. Of course, we're seeing inflation on the rise today. And we forgot the economic impact of destroying business links between suppliers and upstream suppliers and customers and suppliers, and those kinds of supply chain bottlenecks that were created because of our COVID-19 policies still plague us today. We also forgot the Popperian idea of verifying models and theories against data as it came in. We had data in March 2020, and we continued to accumulate it, that showed us that COVID was disproportionately targeting the elderly. We had an experiment in the form of the Ruby Princess debacle, which showed us how bad it could actually get with a bunch of people who were confined together in close quarters, all pretty much probably getting exposed to COVID. But we did not do that verification of our models and our theories against data as it came in. We essentially betrayed the principles of science. How did this all happen? How did we forget all of these things? Well, crowds formed on the back of an incredible amount of fear around the West, which was fanned by media reports and continued to be fanned by governments as well as the pandemic progressed. And the crowds that formed were ones that I had never seen in my lifetime. I didn't pick them. I don't know of anybody who was seeing them and picking them in March or April of 2020. But they have been seen in human history before. We've seen them in the witch hunts. We saw them in the 1930s in Germany. We saw them even in Prohibition in my country in the 20s. A crowd obsesses about one thing and forgets about everything else. There is a collective amnesia, and the people who are in that crowd do not see it, but their minds have been hijacked by the logic of the crowd. Whatever the crowd says is true or moral is what they then defend as being true or moral. Their minds become a rationalization machine for the truth of the crowd, and they are no longer thinking critically and rationally about the data in front of them. And this was my experience when trying to have these conversations throughout COVID with people who were in the crowd. I would throw facts against the wall and they would fall off. It was like throwing spaghetti against Teflon. And I only understood after many months that this is what was going on. So once that crowd took hold, there was a great deal of exploitation by people who were in positions of power and who stood to gain from exploiting the power, the fear that crowd was nurturing in people. And so populations were betrayed by elites both in the government and in the private sector throughout this period. That exploitation has just been entrenched even further. And of course, many of those trends were continuing what had previously to COVID been already seen. The increase in capital concentration, the decrease in the labor share, basically a not very healthy economic situation, high inequality within countries, growing inequality, and all of those things got worse, much, much worse during COVID. So what do we do now? If those were the problems, how do we protect ourselves the next time? Well, I'll just mention a few. I know I only have 5 minutes. I'll just mention a few things, and we may be able to go into some details later in the evening. But I will also refer everyone to my book, The Great COVID Panic, which some of you have on your tables, with Paul Freiters and Michael Baker. That came out last year, and we do talk about some solutions in that book. And if you want to know the scale of the destruction that has been wrought by COVID-19 policies in Australia, I encourage you to have a look at the other book, Do Lockdowns and Border Closures Serve the Greater Good, which is being sold at the table back there, and I'll sign after the event. That came out about a month ago with Connor Court. What should we do? One idea is to use citizens rather than politicians to appoint the tops of our bureaucracies and other publicly funded agencies. This is an attempt to break the link between money and power on the one hand and the ability to control the machinery of state on the other. The machinery of state should, in a democracy, be representative of the interests of the people at large, but that was not the case during COVID. We also advocate that we could have more citizen involvement in media production. The media have been a major problem during this period. They have canceled, censored, denigrated, and generally tried to get off air any alternative views on a variety of different COVID topics. I've been a direct victim of that, but many other people have as well. Sensible people, highly educated, thoughtful, caring people have been canceled. And that's not a healthy way to run a media system. So we advocate that citizens be more directly involved in media, and there are various ideas about how to do that. Certainly having independent rotating advisors for all big decisions to try to break the networks of money and power that people have amassed huge fortunes through during this period to the detriment of peoples at large, including that of Australia, the country I love so much. A legislated inability to restrict freedoms in the future. Perhaps the domestication of the Human Rights Charter, which has not been domesticated here in Australia, although we are a signatory of it. An independently reviewed adverse reaction system, a DANES system, for any other provisionally approved drug. Our present DANES system is dysfunctional and is not capable of reporting on side effects accurately of the provisionally approved COVID vaccines. To return power from bureaucratic organizations like APRA and the AMA back to practicing professionals who went to university and got advanced degrees and have a lot of experience for a reason, because they have considered opinions that are probably more likely to be correct than those of bureaucrats in central offices. And in general, the creation of new groups to replace the old groups that are now tainted with their complicity during this period. such as the new AMPS group, the new AMN group. There's a group called Australians for Science and Freedom that I hope to be able to announce soon, and other groups in all sorts of professions all over the country that are growing and drawing strength from the scale of the resistance and the pain and anger that has been created by the destruction of this period. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Gigi, for those forthright and very clear views. Paul.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting discussion tonight, and we may not necessarily agree on everything, but, you know, however we've managed to get here, it's great that we can get to a position in the pandemic where we can hold an event like this with so many people who feel safe to sit in the same room. So I think we've certainly come a long way. And, you know, it's easy to be critical in retrospect, but we do have to remember that at the start of this pandemic, we were dealing with a very new entity, a virus we understood very little about, and in fact, it probably had properties that made it just the perfect type of pathogen to do what it's done. It's obviously highly infectious, very easily transmissible, and we've got countless examples, including the Ruby Princess, of that. It caused mild illness in enough people that they mixed in the population and contributed to the spread, but caused severe disease in enough that the impact was very significant. And while a lot of people have focused on those with comorbidities and the elderly as those being at risk, we have seen it cause terrible disease even in young children and young fit and well adults with seemingly no risk factors. So it is something we had to take very seriously, and not a pathogen that we'd ever encountered before. So while I think we were not well positioned to handle this pandemic in terms of our other plans, we also couldn't pull off the shelf any of the plans that we had for other pathogens. We also had no vaccines and no therapies for this class of organism, and I think it's been one of the greatest feats of medical research and science to come up with a range of highly safe and effective vaccines and specific antiviral therapies, which have contributed to getting to the point we're at now, where we can largely restore a fairly normal way of life with obviously some ongoing restrictions. And, you know, I think we certainly do have to reflect and learn on the lessons, and I think there's lots of things we could have done better. Personally, I describe our response in this country as one of extremes. We went too far in one direction, and then seemingly overnight we pivoted to the opposite direction, and that there was probably a middle ground we could have followed all along. But, you know, in the end, I think we've been relatively successful in this country, and when we compare to that of other countries, I think the way we've handled things, you know, we certainly need to learn from those mistakes, but hasn't been quite as bad as many people will say. And, you know, there's been a lot of disagreement. I've been part of that. People have been free or felt that they could send me emails and messages saying all sorts of things about what I've said publicly. But I think we also have to remember there's one common enemy here, and I think it's the virus. And the best way we can combat that enemy is to continue to do all the right things that we know will address that, and, you know, get to a level of control where this virus, we're probably not going to get rid of it, but I think we can control it, and that should be the aim in the near future.
Thank you very much, Paul. Peter.
Thanks, Peter. I guess I got a slightly different perspective from people who've spoken already, because I was actually called back to Canberra. I'd retired, left the Productivity Commission, but called back to Canberra to run this thing called the National COVID Commission, which I agreed to do for 6 months, and 6 months only, because I've done crisis management before. I've run a bushfire response, which I'm in Victoria, where we managed to kill 173 people and fight fire for many weeks after that. So I knew something about crisis management when I came back. I didn't know much about health, no health background, and I didn't know much about viruses. And but I was asked, I think, to come back primarily because I have this ability to kind of bridge across different parts of the bureaucracy. Most of my jobs in the bureaucracy, other than when I ran the Productivity Commission, were about massive scale projects that required multiple departments and the private sector to cooperate and coordinate. So I sort of had that and the crisis management skill. And the funny thing for me, as we address the topic that you've got tonight and others have, and Peter said earlier, we do a lot of this with hindsight. Well, I sort of did it in real time when I was there, because I didn't know what the mechanism for managing COVID's response or response to a pandemic in Australia was. I have no expertise in that. I'd never worked in the health department. And so when I got there and we're trying to set up this kind of private sector group to help the government coordinate with the private sector's contribution to how we're going to manage this crisis, I revert, as most people would, to, well, what do I know about crisis, which was how to manage bushfire response. And scarred on me is the fact that we did manage a bushfire response and we managed it pretty badly, and a lot of people died. So I guess all through that process, the 6 months I was there, and then for months after that, when I was still in informal communication with the people who were working both in the States and in the Commonwealth with this, had this view about why don't we borrow from that which, and as I said, I come from an area where we perhaps had extreme fire and didn't manage it that well, but we've got a structure for fighting fire and flood in Australia that does work quite well. It's crisis management. And moreover, it's managed primarily by a civilian response rather than a military response. So this is what I would call, civil response to catastrophe. We have a structure like that. We resource it. Every year we review it. We improve it. I don't see any likelihood now, and I couldn't see any likelihood then, that we were drawing on the lessons from that which we have invested in and which the community has a reasonable degree of confidence in, notwithstanding the fact that we do badly sometimes with our fire and our flood response. There's no parallel at all between that kind of response to civil catastrophe and how a pandemic is managed. The pandemic was managed by a set of expert committees. And yes, there were politicians who had immense power under biosecurity legislations, but in the end, and I know this from trying to influence that decision making, there were committees, and there were health committees, and they were not at all interested in the opinions or judgments of anyone who wasn't a health professional. And I can understand that, because they're faced, as Paul has said, with a terrible conundrum. No one knows much about this virus, people are dying, how do we respond? But there was a very limited role in their activity in the 6 months I was in Canberra, and subsequently for considering wider input than just that of health professionals, who themselves were in disagreement, as we all know, to a degree, and that's fair enough in an uncertain circumstance. But we actually have a structure from which we could borrow, if we wanted to, for thinking, instead of thinking about the next pandemic, think about the next civil catastrophe where we have to suspend business as usual, where the kind of public policies that we normally implement, which rely on information, cooperation, incentives, things like that, for you to choose how well you will respond to public policy. We didn't do any of that in the pandemic. We did what I call command and control, which is what public health response is, characterised as much as anything by the fact that we use the army continuously, or the police force. They're command and control institutions. That's what we did. So when we've abandoned what I might call our normal way of designing and implementing public policy for command and control. We did so, I think, for probably pretty good reasons early on, because we had no idea what we were dealing with. But we persisted with it for months and then into years with a command and control kind of philosophy, whilst voices were saying, there's other ways of doing this if you want to. But the health response and these expert committees were preeminent. And I'm not saying that to criticise them, because, they got the catastrophe right, it just fell upon them. And we had these committee structures and these ministers who were not usually the leaders of government, they were the health ministers, with these immense powers to issue public health orders. So I think as we look to the future, it's much better than designing for the next pandemic, because I reckon we'll always be wrong by guessing what the next catastrophe is. It may not be the next pandemic, but it could be a massive heat wave event as a result of climate change, they're incredibly deadly, these things, right? And Europe had one, 12 months ago that killed a hell of a lot of people. No one paid much attention to it because all these people dying from heat. But in Australia, we've got the capacity to see this happen. So it could be that as a civil catastrophe, Or it could be, I guess we could then go on. I like to say it could be the asteroid hits Earth event. What the hell is that? I don't know. I just use that as a sort of descriptor. But it'd be a lot better if we designed for the next civil catastrophe than simply designed for the next pandemic.
Thank you, Peter. Izzy.
Hi, I'm Izzy, and I'm very grateful to be a part of this panel in my capacity primarily as a panel member for the independent review into the way Australia dealt with the pandemic. And I was on that panel with Peter as well, where we met. What we found through the process of the review primarily was that social fault lines weren't considered from the outset of the pandemic response. We set out at the very beginning of our review with absolutely no idea how the review would look or what direction it would take, which I really valued. I also really valued that it was philanthropically funded, apolitical, and that was a really important characteristic of what would be a non-partisan review and fair review. We had over 350 people involved as stakeholders and people that we were seeking advice and experience from, and their perspectives, and lots of submissions from the public as well. And as I said, the recurring theme was that COVID hit like an earthquake, and these social fault lines were exacerbated, and so many members of our communities were left behind because of pre-existing vulnerabilities that we hadn't yet addressed pre-pandemic. What we found was that people born overseas had a death rate nearly 2.5 times as high as people born in Australia. Many women were affected disproportionately, and 30% more women left the workforce in the early months of the pandemic due to requirements at home and care responsibilities. Young people that lived in the lowest 20% in terms of socioeconomic status had much less access to the technology they needed to get the right education that they deserved. And as we can see, all of these things, there's just a domino effect into the future that we don't even know what that will look like. But what we found is that there are four areas that we could have done better in. One being that economic support should have been distributed more fairly and equitably. We should have had less lockdowns and less border closures. Schools should have stayed open primarily, and we should have prioritised care for the elderly. These are the areas that the people told us about. This wasn't from us as the panel. We were listening to the experiences of Australians and people who represented groups of Australians, and they're the conclusions we came to. Of course, we extrapolated 5 lessons from that, being that societal fault lines had to be kept front of mind, that we need to prioritise planning and preparing and practising for really any national crisis, as Peter was describing, and that it's really important to avoid the perils of overreach, which a lot of these policies that were implemented, unfortunately, did. That there were overreaching policies, and they really affected Australians as a whole, particularly people from specific groups. And then, of course, we created 6 recommendations that can be implemented to set the frameworks to respond to the next national crisis without having to exacerbate these social fault lines. I learnt so much throughout this whole process. I'm a uni student myself. I'm in my 4th year of medicine. I spent my humble 6 years as an adult studying the kidneys and the pathogenesis of arthritis. Haven't had much time in this politics, economic space, but I really appreciated that the panel, the group behind our report valued diversity on the panel, and I learnt a lot from people like Peter. And I'm very keen to learn a lot from the rest of the panel as well today, and ask questions as well, because usually I'm researching all the vocab that everyone's saying, but I don't have that today, so I'll have to be asking everyone else. But yes, thank you for having me, and I'm really, really grateful to be a part of a really important discussion.
Well, thank you, Izzy. So there's a lot in those opening remarks, and I want to try and draw out some points in particular. And Paul, I'll start with you on the question of expertise, because health experts in particular, played a fundamentally important role in the policies that were put together. So how do you best fold expertise into decision-making? There's no such thing as a single expert view on anything, so how do you reconcile differing expert opinions? And if war is too important to leave to generals, is a pandemic too important to leave to epidemiologists?
Oh, look, thanks for that question. I think I'm going to start by saying what I'll probably say to all the questions tonight is it's a really tough question to answer. And look, the question of experts, I think, has been a central thing to how this pandemic's played out. And if you believe social media, there's probably around 2 million experts in Brisbane on infectious diseases and epidemiology, and they're quite happy to tell me that's the case. And I think there's clearly a role for experts in infectious diseases and epidemiology, microbiology, for example, in something like this. But, I think there's a big role for a large number of other experts as well. And perhaps we didn't focus on getting a broad enough mix of experts involved. And then I think a lot of the messaging, while there were experts involved, a lot of the messaging was then conveyed by politicians. And, one of the phrases I really didn't like hearing a lot was, it's the health advice. And so, we're led to believe there were appropriate expert consultation that led to a lot of that advice, but often we didn't know, even people who are relatively closely involved didn't know who was giving that advice or what that advice was. So I think there was certainly scope for a lot more transparency in terms of what some of that expert advice was. And I think it's really clear that one of the learnings we should take away is we should be more evidence-based in what we do, and that the evidence base needs to be well communicated to people, hopefully as motivation for people to follow that advice well. I think if the rationale was available for a lot of the decision making that we heard about, that adherence might have been something that was easier to do. And I think we just didn't have the structure around this response to know who the experts were, who should be immediately in the driver's seat, and how they can interact with other experts as well as politicians who ultimately, I guess, are responsible, but need to be putting together a lot of different opinions. And I'll probably say this in response to nearly every question tonight, but an organisation like a CDC in Australia, so I think it's been called the ACDC, which I think is going to be a bit confusing, but an Australian Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, as a way of bringing together a lot of experts before the next pandemic, making sure the right linkages and resources are in place. And it should involve infectious diseases, epidemiology, but academia and industry, mental health should be a big part of that. There should be, input from cultural leaders and faith leaders as well. I think we need a lot of strong leadership to help, get these messages to everyone that needs them. And I think, we've heard well about a lot of these fault lines, and I think, that a lot of that wasn't considered, and we needed expertise in all those areas, in Indigenous health, for example, and other minority or highly vulnerable groups who suffered greatly during the pandemic. And in my opinion, aged care would be a really big one there. And we can't have a one-size-fits-all response to something like this. So having appropriate expertise in some of those areas, some of those fault lines, and those areas where we saw the greatest impact, I think would have been really helpful. So yeah, it's not easy, but I think it's a big area for improvement.
Thank you. Gigi, one of the consequences of expert advice to the government from the beginning was we ended up with lockdowns. And I know you've written about this and you've done a cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns. So my question to you is, at the beginning of this pandemic, when people didn't know really what they were dealing with, do you think there was a reasonable case for lockdowns? And is your position they should never have been lockdowns, or that lockdowns were used excessively for too long and with too far reach?
So I'll first comment on the notion of experts and expertise and the role of expertise. I think we've had a tyranny of experts during this period. People on the street have been, thank you. People on the street have been told that it's not okay for them to have an opinion or to look up and have their own critical analysis of a literature. And I think that's extremely corrosive, particularly to a democratic country like Australia, where we would like there to be a diversity of views, as you say, brought to bear on any given question. And the idea that you're not supposed to think is very dangerous in a democracy. That's very dangerous. And remember, these experts, by and large, were either one of two types. One, they were captured by the crowd dynamic I spoke about before. So they weren't really acting in the role of expert that they would normally do. They were following the crowd and they were rationalizing what the crowd said should be done. So that's not providing independent expert advice. Or, second camp, they were profiting in some way, either monetarily or in terms of their power, by giving a particular kind of advice. We talk about this in the Great COVID Panic in the chapter on science. Being in science myself, I can tell you there are problems there, and this is a perfect example of those problems. And I think we have a lot of work to do in recovering our ability to do science scientifically, to actually truly pursue science, which is itself a pursuit of truth, but never an arrival at truth. There is never one truth. So when you ask me, the experts said we should do lockdowns, should we not have done them? First of all, the experts didn't say that we should do lockdowns before 2020. The pre-2020 pandemic management plans, as I said, did not anywhere say that in reaction to any respiratory virus, we should lock down whole, healthy populations. We do not even do that for Ebola. It was simply a completely extreme policy selection by people who were extremely scared and by politicians who saw the scared people and felt that they had to do something. The politician's syllogism, something must be done. There's something, let's do that. It had nothing to do with actual protection of human health. It had to do with satisfying the people who were petrified and following that political incentive to provide protection from what they were so afraid of, which I believe was a cowardly response. The more courageous response, and we did see it around the world in various places, such as in Sweden by Anders Tegnell, the president of Tanzania, we saw it in Belarus, was to patriotically and courageously say, no, I'm not going to do that. That's going to hurt my country. I'm not going to lock down and cut out of schools and close businesses of my whole people here in order to combat this respiratory virus, which clearly, according to the data, is not a threat to most working people more than a standard flu. Okay? So it was not actually expert advice that drove us into lockdowns, the way that I would classify it. And moreover, the burden of proof during this period was shifted from the shoulders of government, where it usually resides. When the government wants to do a policy, it has to justify why, to the shoulders of people like me, who were saying, don't do it. Why did the burden of proof shift to me? I had to prove, and people like me had to prove, that lockdowns weren't a good idea. These were the most draconian, unprecedented policies in terms of restrictions of freedom we've ever seen in certainly post-World War II Australia. I'll leave it at that.
So I think all of that raises the way in which expert advice and government decisions flowed and came together. And Peter, I want to ask you this question because you're someone who's worked in government. Was there an abdication of political responsibility by leaders who consistently said that they based all of their decisions on what the experts advised them to do? So where did expert advice end and political responsibility begin or not begin from your perspective?
I've got a different way of saying what a tough question that is than Paul does. I want to say it can only be a personal judgment, Peter. But I did see them up close for 6 months daily, and I think you don't want to ignore or eliminate from your thinking the fact that most political leaders were as frightened as any individual person was by the uncertainty created by this virus. Now, that's in one sense to say, well, they're only human beings, and they are. But I think, as Gigi has said, the fear that can create a sort of mob effect and then snowball from there, it's not limited to just people outside the area of control. It happens inside the area of control. So I would say, just from my personal judgment, that the utter uncertainty in those first few months about what we were dealing with, and where experts were clearly, and all of them genuine experts, clearly disagreeing. And in particular, I remember the discussions about whether it was ever plausible to have a vaccine developed in the kind of timeframes that would make a practical difference to this. That's something that I think now we've got vaccines and everyone goes, oh, fantastic. See, it wasn't as hard as you thought. It's just a remarkable scientific achievement to get there. So I do think fear takes hold at the leadership level, and it's very hard, I think, when there's split responsibility as well. So the other thing to bear in mind here is, the states have more control of the health system than the federal government does, but the federal government wants something done in health. Generally speaking, it buys it, pays money. It's got more money than the states, but the states have got actual control of the health system. So that split responsibility, what it invites is a, how can I put it, a sharing of responsibility, a level of mutual acceptance that does draw you very actively towards the lowest common denominator solution. What's the lowest common denominator solution? We're facing something terrible, let's shut the show down, while we're facing it. So there's a pull towards that without a doubt. But it's just my opinion.
Izzy, I wanted to take you back to the Fault Lines report, excellent report, downloadable and free, by the way. Now, the main argument there was that vulnerable groups were disproportionately adversely affected, and that their position should have been better factored into policy making right at the outset. So can you just talk a little bit about how that would happen? I mean, if we were doing this again and we were bringing together a policy framework, what would we have to do differently to try and make sure that vulnerable groups are not so exposed? Because you could argue the fact that they are vulnerable means inevitably they're going to be disproportionately affected. So could you say something about that?
I guess in an ideal world, it doesn't take a pandemic to make people aware of how important it is to support different groups of people in the ways that they need to be supported because of their inherent differences. There are migrant communities, younger people, there's issues with gender, there's issues with race, and we're all aware of these things on a day-to-day basis. And a pandemic really shone the light on that because of the exacerbated effects, but also the vulnerabilities exacerbated the virus as well. Certain people weren't in a position to comply properly with the policies that were put in place because of their vulnerabilities, because of the fact they otherwise wouldn't be able to put food on the table for their families and things like that. And so then, of course, they'd need to leave their house or need to leave to cross borders or whatever they needed to do. And that spread the virus as well. So then we think, oh, that's terrible, the virus is spreading. We should think about these vulnerabilities. So it's taken a long time to get to a point where we see the value in so many different facets of acknowledging and supporting our differences. We are a very, very diverse community of people in Australia, and that needs to be factored into any policy implementation, not just in response to a national crisis. What we found in the report is, as Paul mentioned, a CDC would be amazing. We need to avoid the perils of overreach so that we can implement really specifically targeted policies that don't allow people to fall through the cracks. And we need to share data better. We need to have better quality data for that to happen. So that's one of those practical recommendations that we suggested needed to be implemented. Collaboration between jurisdictions and within the public service sector. There are all these practical implementations, but at the heart of it is acknowledging our differences. And that's not a new concept. It's just been, I guess, put at centre stage. From my perspective as a young person, there were 2-3 years that really got in the way of a usual process of growing up, really, in a social and educational career. From all of those perspectives, lots of people missed out on developing and forming friendships and relationships that, I guess, colour our youthful years, as well as the career opportunities, the networking opportunities, the travelling opportunities, those social and career, such important parts of our lives that were really affected by the implementation of really strict policies. At the end of the day, I do believe that decisions were impossible to make in such a fog of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, I think the common ground for all of us is that we're all prioritising the health and well-being of Australians as much as we can and as far-reaching as we possibly can. And then what's the way to do that? Well, some people considered that contracting the COVID virus was the end of good health, and others would say that good health is made up of so many more factors than just whether you have the virus or not. So, I mean, I put my hats off to everyone involved in the discussion in those first few years. I was just trying to study from home. I had no idea of all these structures and the red tape. I only discovered what red tape actually properly means in the last couple of years. And I'm realising how complicated it all is. There are so many mouths to feed, so many opinions, so many experts, and it's almost impossible to come to a conclusion. But I think the only thing we can do from here is actually learn from the experience, and that's why reviews are so important. We owe it to the lives that were lost, the families that were affected. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. I went on a bit of a tangent, but... No,
that's good. Gigi, I want to go back to something you said in your opening remark, which was they ought to be a bigger role for citizens. And I don't think anyone would argue with the sentiment, but how do you do that? I mean, a traditional view is that the representative of citizens is government, because governments get elected in democracies like ours. Are you suggesting that there is a bigger role, or governments are not sufficiently empowered or mandated to do the things they need to do? I'm just interested in how this bigger role for citizens will actually manifest itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So first I'll just say in relation to the Australian CDC idea, I think that's a horrible idea, actually. Sorry, that's not going to be our common ground. Because that's kind of just another step in the direction of more centralization and potential tyranny and overreach and power abuse. And the opposite of that is to decentralize power, to disseminate power. Power is a drug. It is an aphrodisiac. And we forget that very important lesson of political history at our peril. We've learned it in the past, and we just forget it every time. Somehow every generation has to relearn that when people get too much power, they abuse it. They will do almost anything to keep it and extend it. Lie, cheat, steal, kill their own family. That's what happens when people have too much power. So we need to disseminate it. And one of the real problems in Australia today, and this is something that infects the citizens of other Western countries as well, is a great deal of political apathy. Kind of in Australia, you'd say a she'll be right sort of attitude. You know, oh, it's all right, whatever, we'll just have a barbecue and not really take part in the running of or the monitoring of our nation. How are we doing? Are we doing the right things? Are decisions that are being made in the halls of power actually representing the interests of these people? In Australia, generally speaking, these days, because most political representatives are career politicians, their decisions are representing their own career interests, not any actual people in Australia. So there's a real problem there with a mismatch between what is good for the people and what often motivates decisions in the halls of power. And it can't really be forwarded with elections alone, because elections, once every little while, every year or 2 years, whatever, you go and you look at this huge line of things. You have this massive ballot. There's the animal party and the bullet train party and everything else, and people think of it almost as a chore. I don't even, what are these people standing for? I don't know. You're not voting on particular policies. You're not voting on anything really other than often just one big party or another, right? The meme going around these days is, the trolley problem where you have to pull the lever and it changes the track. Well, it either changes from red to blue, but there's still a lot of people on the track and they're going to die either way, right? So the elections have become sort of almost, I won't say farcical, but just a real echo of what they could be if you're really wanting to get the voice of the people into decision making. So we propose in the Great COVID Panic, and we write about this on the Brownstone Institute's website. There's a blog site up there, free to everybody. You can read it if you like. That what we could establish is a system of citizen juries modeled on what we use in the criminal justice system, whereby everybody who is a citizen in the nation is on this roll. And when we need to appoint a new head of, let's say, the education ministry or the health ministry or my university or any other body that gets a lot of public money, a jury is convened of 20 to 30 people, and that group for 2 or 3 months deliberates upon whom to appoint in that position of great power, actually. Because at the moment, those are political appointees, which feeds the network of power and money, and that makes the incentives that person has be much more aligned with those of the people in power than with the people who are being governed. So that's one proposal, and I think generally more direct democracy. So I noticed that one of the sponsors of Brisbane Dialogues is New Democracy. They're doing some very good work. I think there's also referenda. One could imagine having more actual participation of citizens in the running of their country. Is one of the directions I think we should move. And we should be talking about institutional adjustments. We should not just be saying, oh, well, too bad, everything needs to be done better next time, let's learn. We have to make actual changes to our institutions if we want to avoid this kind of tragedy again.
How are the juries appointed? How are the juries appointed?
Well, they'll be randomly selected just as they are in the criminal justice system.
Well, maybe we could get some other views on that, because it seems to me broadening the input into decision-making is something that, many people have posited as being important next time around, and it was certainly part of the Fault Lines report. So I wouldn't mind just getting a reaction from the other 3 panellists to what Gigi has been saying. Isabel?
Yeah, I think diversity was a key word that kept coming up in the Fault Lines report, and that's diversity of people that are making decisions and then inputting the information to decision makers. And I mean, diversity has been working forever. It's how we evolve. It's diverse genetics are then selected because of an environmental pressure, and that makes us stronger. And what I'm saying there is that the more information we have, the stronger, more robust policies we can make that serve the greatest amount of people. I am wondering, Gigi, is there an example of a country that does this well?
I'm not aware of any at the moment. Clapping, good. I'm not aware of any at the moment that does it exactly as we have in mind, but there are a number of other thinkers who are moving in this kind of direction. And the idea, the New Democracy people have actually piloted something like this, where you get citizens to cope with a particular issue that is on the agenda at a local council, for example, or a local, even a state. And rather than having the politicians deliberate, you just form a jury and you ask them, okay, well, what do you think about this? And you basically try to get independent, unimpeded, unencumbered, uncomplicit views, right, that are kind of no skin in the game, right? One of the reasons I think I've been able to play the role that I have during this period is that I literally have no skin in the game. I'm employed by UNSW. I get no funding from any external body, not even the ARC anymore, certainly no medical body, right? Nobody's paying me to do anything. I don't even have a secretary, right? That is useful. And we want more people who have that kind of, sitting on the sidelines almost kind of position to be able to come in and to be respected for the strength that they provide in a moment of crisis. As you said, diversity is a source of strength. We become very stupid very fast when we censor a minority opinion. And in fact, minority opinion is the source of our innovation in every area of our lives, right? Everything that you see here was invented at some point by some guy who was the only person thinking it at the time. So if we shut down minority opinion, we shut down innovation, which means we shut down growth, which means we shut down the mechanism for making our lives better. So I couldn't agree with you more that diversity is incredibly important. The mechanism of eliciting that diversity is the key that we need to be thinking about. And I think if a similar crowd, mob thinking, herd dynamic overtakes us again, no matter how diverse your group, you're still going to get misguided decision making. So there is also a role, I think, for editing institutions such that they are somehow less vulnerable to being captured by such a crowd. And that is a much more difficult problem to crack, particularly in the days of mass media, where the media really is part of what fed the crowd dynamic and made it form and made everybody just forget about so many other things that mattered and therefore destroy so much more welfare. So in response to that, we have proposed that citizens could be directly involved in media, and even that we could have a system of conscription into media production, which is an extreme way of doing it, but we just want to open the field for thoughts, to generate people's ideas. How can we get the media to be more diverse and get the messages you're receiving in your inbox not just to be an echo chamber?
Peter, do you have a view? Sorry, is it?
Oh, no, sorry. I'm going to say, it's one thing to have those diverse perspectives that then that come to a decision and a conclusion, but then it's also disseminating that information in diverse ways that will actually reach the people in the languages that they need, through the channels that they need, which is what we found as well. It's very well to have a decision made, particularly in a crisis situation where there needs to be decisive instructions and guidance and information sharing, but if it doesn't get to the people, then what's the good of it? And so, investing in the right channels and the right people to translate is really important as well.
Peter, I'm interested in your view, and then I want to get Paul's view.
Swap ya.
Okay, look, no one's going to disagree on having diversity. That's what I was basically saying with my fire and flood-based analogy. When we manage a fire, we have everybody involved in the emergency control centre who could possibly have, an effect on our performance. And it's not just what I might call a command and control group. In other words, the people who go out and say, don't cross this flooded stream or whatever. So that's important to imagine. There are many more diverse personalities involved, and they're resourced for that purpose and they're trained for that purpose. We actually go through a process where if you're going to be, a communications officer in the next emergency response, you're trained to be a communications officer. Not your standard day-to-day job, but you're given time off to do this, to do the training. And then when the catastrophe occurs, you literally put the bib on. It's a bib, it says this is what you are, and you can tell the Commissioner of Police, I'm sorry, that communications message is not going out because I'm the communications officer for the emergency response, and that's the way it goes. And the important thing from this is not so much whether you admire that structure or not, but that what I could see with the COVID response was there was no such training for anybody engaged. They had not been resourced prior to this. People have been told that you're going to be on this committee and you're going to make this decision in this pandemic sort of era, but they had not been trained and they hadn't been given that sort of continuous, every year there's a renewal of the training. Plus, we supplement the workforces with volunteers. So in an indirect way, it's not really what Gigi's advocating, but in an indirect way, we get a lot more people involved through this via the volunteers, by the SES, Country Fire Authority in Victoria substantially volunteers. It's a sort of a community managed kind of response, and again they've got to be trained for this purpose and they've got to be resourced, and the culture of the professional responders has to respect and therefore be trained to respect the response of the volunteer responders. So it's principles like that that I think are very important if we're going to try and manage a COVID response, or indeed any other kind of what I call civil catastrophe, better in the future than simply calling in the army and the police and saying shut the show down. I mean, we've got to resource this way better, and we should be thinking, as I said at the outset, we should be thinking not just of the next pandemic, but of similar civil catastrophes where undoubtedly, if we face what we are likely to face, for example, in climate change, you may well find that we're doing this kind of thing again, and you just don't want to do it the way we did COVID. So that's my version of diversity. It's getting much greater intensity of involvement than just what I might call the health professionals. Then there's nothing wrong with them. They're going to have to lead. They're going to have to be the primary scientist kind of thing. But you need a vast array of people who are engaged and trained to be engaged for the response in the future.
Thank you. So, Paul, should the next Chief Health Officer be selected by a randomly convened jury?
Look,
You can be on it.
no, thanks. Look, it's tricky, and I just echo the sentiments there that, you know, all those things about expertise and training, and, you know, that's what I would see the role of that CDC is. It's not about power, it's not about taking over anything or increasing the power of these individuals, but bringing together the right people to make sure they are trained appropriately and that they work together and there's a governance structure that supports what they do and that it's diverse and inclusive, so that it's the right representatives are there and not in a hurry before the next pandemic, but in advance so that the input can be there and we can have good plans. And, you know, what would have been the ideal situation for a pandemic like this is that we had robust plans that were flexible and able to cope with a vast array of threats that were practiced, rehearsed, refined over time. There was a mechanism for ongoing review once it was implemented that was more rapid than, you know, having to wait for, you know, an expert review like you guys have done and done such a good job of. But, you know, it was perhaps a little far down the track for us to implement some of those things early and, you know, maybe address that overreach in real time rather than having to reflect on it down the track. And, you know, that's what I would see the role of the CDC would be, is to, you know, bring together a lot of these learnings so that we're prepared. And it wouldn't just handle communicable diseases, it would handle other threats and other diseases that we need to have a better response to as well. So look, I think there's a lot we can take away from that, and hopefully you know, we'd have to make sure it's set up well and resourced and that there was, you know, really good terms of reference, for example, on how it would operate. But I would see that it could address a lot of the challenges we've been discussing.
Thank you. I just want to shift gears a bit and address this issue of how our federation performed during COVID, because we all kind of discovered things about our federation that we thought had long passed. Peter, you've been involved in a lot of federal-state issues. I think you famously said once that COAG, the collection of Australian governments,
Council of Australian Governments.
Council of Australian Governments was where all good ideas go to die. The National Cabinet,
and I've never got the recognition for that statement that I deserve.
Well, there you are. Tonight's the first. National Cabinet. Do you think that was a good idea? Do you think it worked? Do you think it was national? And did it make decisions in a way cabinets normally do?
Starting with the last, no, it didn't make decisions the way cabinets normally do. It was quite a unique entity, didn't have the full formalities of cabinet processes. But that wasn't such a bad thing. I can answer your question best, Peter, by comparing what we might call the COAG kind of process, which is historically, we've had it for more than 20 years until this, or the national cabinet process. And the primary differentiation between the two, from my perspective, is that the states got to put things on the agenda for national cabinet. The states were more responsible for the delivery of services in the pandemic than might be considered the general run of the Commonwealth versus state arrangements. And so that was worthwhile. It was worthwhile from the perspective that, you know, states had to take some responsibility for making their decisions, and the Commonwealth had to respect the fact that they had the power to do this. Did it work brilliantly? I don't think it did work brilliantly. It was also a mechanism by which there wasn't uniformity of decision. Now, from my perspective, it's preferable that you have non-uniform decisions led by the people who've got most skin in the game. And we did see some of those. Not all the time, but we did see some of those. And they were primarily states that did that, particularly in what I might call the development of the exit strategy. One of the really stark things to me in all this is, you know, I've told some people in Canberra this previously. I did it in the middle of last year while we were still doing this thing. I said, there's no exit plan. No one's got an exit plan. And I did that to challenge somebody. I did it in public comments and that kind of thing, and no one corrected me. And then I was talking to some people in New Zealand about theirs, and they were even, well, I said, come on, you guys are always better than us on public policy, and the Kiwis, you know, no exit plan either. And that's the thing. We went through this, you know, deep confrontation of great uncertainty, looking for, you know, how to manage the immediate short-term effects, and often just keeping on exercising this command and control thing, because that's what we had, right? And hoping for vaccines. And we finally got vaccines. We still didn't have an exit plan. Best I can work it out, looking backwards, the exit plan was, oh, everyone's got some vaccines, and you know, we're, I think, second best in the OECD for vaccinations. Woohoo, that's, you know, maybe not it's a bad thing, but the point is, as an exit strategy, if you look at it from a point of view of how many people died, didn't work. When we finally did release our command and control mechanisms, when we finally let the borders open and dropped some of our other restrictions, by comparison with some other countries who had been more flexible, we had more deaths, many more deaths. And we don't know that now. We still don't know that. The common philosophy is we did really well, not so many people died in Australia. Well, there's some OECD benchmarks that'll show you, and I think Gigi's got some other work, you know, but we'll tell you that we did really well with our command and control, not just in terms of deaths in 2020 and then 2021, and we did terribly when we finally did what I'm going to call the exit strategy, which is, well, we vaccinated everybody, it must be all right now. So I'm not saying I had a better plan, I'm just saying there wasn't one. And that's a really bad thing. So the next time around, for those who get to make some decisions on this, whatever we do, we've got to have an exit plan. In other words, and it's a discipline, personally, from my long experience in public policy design, when you say that to people, you've got to have an exit plan. It deeply influences what the entry activity is. In other words, if I haven't got an exit plan, perhaps this is a bad idea. Perhaps we should think of something else. So, I don't know, got lost a bit there. Anyway, it's an important point I want to make. It was going to always be my final point for tonight. So you've already heard it, and I'll shut up at the end. Thanks.
I'll open it up to questions shortly, but before I do, I just wanted to ask each of you, of the many things that maybe we should do differently next time around, what would you put at the top of the list? So what is the single most important thing to do differently for the next pandemic?
Do I have to answer first? Is this something that's feasibly achievable, or is it something that in a fairy tale world I would say that was the key thing that was bad?
No, the former.
Feasibly achievable. Get governments to commit tomorrow to never locking down Australian borders within the country and shutting businesses and closing schools.
No lockdowns. Paul?
In many ways, I'd be inclined to agree. I think it's the overreach part. I think we mixed up politics with the health advice. I think some of these approaches became or were perceived as politically popular and led to a lot of that overreach. And, you know, I just wanted to say that there were other options and other countries did do a better job. We've heard some examples, but I was in Asia on Friday and heard from the people responsible for the Taiwanese response, and they had a much more precise response than we did. And they ended up with, you know, good mortality figures similar to us, but with an increase in GDP over the course of the pandemic. So I think with better planning and more precision, it could have been done better.
Yeah, I think there's a case for saying we looked at the wrong China. So, Peter.
I think I've done mine.
Okay, Izzy?
I think a lot of this could be boiled down to managing trade-offs better with our differences, societal fault lines front of mind. And by managing trade-offs, I'm talking about the fact that we as humans are we're very complex. A good life, well-being and health, it has multiple factors. It's family, it's connections, it's physical activity, it's food, good food, it's enjoyment as well and freedom, and also not being infected by viruses. That's important too. So I think getting the right people in the room, the diverse people in the room, to, in a very informed way, teach each other, learn from each other, in order to manage trade-offs in the best way possible.
Okay, I think we might open it up to questions from the audience. We do have a roving mic. Could I ask you, if you are asking a question, if you could identify yourself and if you have an affiliation, what that affiliation is, and I would urge you please to ask a succinct question rather than make a statement. So we have one down here.
Simon Bowler, I work at the Mater with Paul. Can I ask Paul and Gigi, early on in the pandemic the mantra was to flatten the curve to prevent our health institutions from being overwhelmed. Do you think we did that? And what do you think might have happened if we hadn't done it? And do you think we did it for too long?
I think we clearly did it for too long. I think that's unquestionable. I think we did do it to a degree, but you know, as I was sort of saying about the Taiwanese approach with precision, we had a very blunt instrument, and they were able to achieve probably a better response than us with no lockdowns. So I actually agree with, you know, lockdowns probably caused more harm than they solved. And, you know, I think some of the learnings were... You know, I think some of the learnings we should take away is to be much more specific and targeted. You know, the best way of locking down a virus would have been done at the source, for example. You know, you put a fire out at the source, you don't wait till it spreads everywhere and then try and simply physically contain it without using other approaches. So, you know, I think we need to learn to do it better. I mean, I think if we talk about healthcare capacity, and it's a topic we often speak about, you know, I don't think we have enough capacity at baseline. I think that's something we should address. And, you know, that goes from, you know, end to end, where our GPs are under immense pressure and under-resourced, our ambulance service, our hospitals, all the way through to our aged care homes in terms of getting people out of hospitals. So, you know, I think that's a big learning we can take away as well, is that we shouldn't have a healthcare system that can't cope with a minimal amount of additional strain because it's almost breaking at baseline.
Gigi, did you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, I think, yes, we not just flattened the curve, we smushed it out of existence by closing the international borders and locking down domestically. And hospital utilization was a tiny fraction of what was being anticipated previously. So, yeah, we did. But the question then is that a reasonable objective? Flattening the curve, you know? I mean, what you're trying to do, presumably, is maximize health and well-being of Australia. And that is definitely not what was done.
I mean, clearly the psychology of the community was a key element, and you referred to fear. You know, in 2020, if anything, Australian communities were asking for more restrictions to be imposed on them rather than less. And funnily enough, the political system responded to it.
Exactly as I described earlier, you know? It's the political imperative that delivers that draconian response, not a public health imperative. And it was driven by, initially, the fear of the population. My mother was a psychologist. I know a little bit about this stuff. And I've studied power for a decade, right? So even though I'm an economist, one must be aware of those kinds of dynamics to understand what happened during COVID. It's not just the economic trade-offs, although they are very important, but the psychology underpinning this is huge. And as a result, I expect over the next several years that we're going to see people recovering from having been a member of the COVID crowd and having done things that they would not ever have expected themselves to do. They would be ashamed to have done previous to 2020. And they're going to have to reckon with that. Some of those people are going to be significantly psychologically shocked by the recognition that they cause damage to themselves, their children, their parents, their communities through their compliance and adherence with all of these mad policies. So I think we're going to have a real psychological trauma on our hands, and we're going to need a lot of psychological support, not just physical health support, but psychologists as well.
So, Gigi, you mentioned trade-offs, and I just want to quickly go around and ask this question. Did we fail miserably with trade-offs?
Yes. I mean, this book, there's just no argument, right? Everybody who has looked at lockdowns around the world, including myself and Sanjeev here for Australia, finds that they were not worth it. If you look at the trade-off that they represent, the cost to the benefits, we estimate in our book that Australian COVID lockdowns cost 68 times what they could possibly have delivered in benefits, where the currency is human well-being, human thriving, something that we would all value. It's not money or, something esoteric. It's, satisfaction with life, our happiness, our well-being. That's not a good trade-off. That's not something we should ever have done. It should not even have been on the table of options.
Paul, do you agree we failed on trade-offs?
I do, and I think we lacked common sense and compassion in a lot of what we did, and I think, involved in some discussions at the time with people who had, dying relatives across the border, we should have absolutely let those people visit, and, that's what I was kind of meaning about extremes. We went from this absolute extreme, which was, do everything zero COVID, to basically doing nothing, whereas I think if we'd presented an option that was in between, that was balanced and sensible, using more precision, adding in, as I said, some common sense and compassion, we probably could have achieved better outcomes that way. So I think we completely lost sight of the trade-offs. And, in public health, we know there's always unintended consequences of everything that you do, and, part of what you're trained to do in that is to evaluate and review those, and I think we didn't look at a lot of those points.
Peter? Trade-offs?
Well, sure, it's pretty obvious, but this is where your point about hindsight does come in. I think at the time, and I think you or someone has already mentioned this, some of these things on surveys were incredibly popular. It's very hard for politicians to push back against popular will without what I would call strong practical support, and I think, and this is not to criticise the health experts, but the fact that they were substantially divided early on over this, how can I put it? You're just describing an ugly political reality here by saying, yes, we didn't get the trade-offs right. To me, the most important thing, acknowledge that, and then decide what is it that you can do better. And I think you could pick some of the singular ugly aspects of our response here and design not to do those things again without wider input. The classic for me is the border closures. I was just staggered when we first did that, and the degree to which there was kind of, it was accepted as being reasonable. Because I was actually commuting then. I was trying to go out to Melbourne to Canberra and then moving up here into Queensland to look after my mother, and then I was stuck on the wrong side of the border and trying to do this job kind of thing. It was just, I just couldn't believe we would make those decisions. But okay, so the important thing I think for next time is border closures are just a really bad idea unless proven to the contrary. So inverse the role of proof, and I think Gigi said earlier, so who is it who will come up with the analysis and in a practical time frame to convince a politician, well, it might just be better to decide these things were bad, certain things were bad, border closures, and we invert it. You can't have one in the future without you do the analysis. That'll be a good way of sort of, because then the incentive is on people who are advocates for this to say, this thing is so truly terrible, even beyond what we suffered in COVID, we must shut borders. I mean, I'm just doing practical design work here, that's what I usually do. So that's what I'd be doing. I'd be trying to pick the worst angles of this, but I would do it in a context, as I said earlier, and I persist with this, where we structure our supposed review of a pandemic response for the next pandemic in a broader way of approaching this as a civil response to catastrophe, not just a health response, even if it is a pandemic, not just a health response.
Thank you. Izzy?
Yeah, I echo a lot of these thoughts. I think definitely trade-offs should have been considered more thoroughly and with the right people involved in those discussions. Community, the role of community was mentioned, and it did make me think something we haven't discussed is like some of the incredible stories that did come out of an incredibly difficult time. At the end of the day, and I saw this with my cohort of young people, we were complying with rules because we wanted to protect primarily older people, more vulnerable people, people with comorbidities. And whether that was right or wrong or whatever conclusion we come to, it's quite amazing that we were all living by that same goal of protecting each other. A lot of innovative ways to learn, to work out, to catch up with friends, to ferry food and wine around the cities. It was incredibly innovative, and it came about because we had this external pressure put on us all, whether that was right or wrong. I think we did an incredible job as a community to get through it. As we did, for the benefit of each other at the end of the day. So I did want to mention that because I think communities played a really important role, particularly organisations, charities, groups that really picked up the slack and dealt with the gaps that this COVID earthquake, when they created those fault lines, those organisations and community groups really did. I guess pick up the gaps and pick up the rubbish behind it also. Yes, I'm just saying my thanks to the community.
Thank you. So I think we'll go upstairs and see if there's a question. I think Kirsty has a mic.
Yes, we have our first question upstairs here from Gabby from Malvern College.
What has the government learnt about the pressures on the medical care system from the current pandemic? We have all seen the extended wait lists for elective surgeries and extensive emergency room lineups. Are there any countries that we can look to mirror their successful medical responses?
Thank you. Paul, maybe you could start.
Look, it's a great question, thank you. I mean, we do need to learn a lot. I mean, as I mentioned, our healthcare system's been under strain for a long time. It essentially operates at capacity at baseline, and, clinicians, we often lose sight of the fact that, we have to be aware that there is a cost and that people need to balance the books and those sorts of things. But I think it's just not sustainable to have a system that can't cope with any additional capacity, and we've actually seen that with not only COVID, but also with our flu season and RSV and other factors. So I don't know that there are any other countries we can necessarily look to for a simple solution, but I think it's great that a lot of reviews like this, and there's a lot of discussion at the moment, but I haven't seen tangible solutions yet. We're building a few hospitals and things like that, but I think the community engagement piece is really important. I think we need to involve a lot more key stakeholders to work out what those solutions are, but the simple fact is we need to increase that capacity significantly, and I think it needs to be a priority.
I think you have to acknowledge, though, that the health system itself in the face of a pandemic is going to, maybe not crack, but is going to be severely impacted. And it's not just the number of individuals who might present with the disease, it's the disease being communicated to the health professionals themselves and the loss of staff that comes out of that, and therefore the loss of capability to respond. And probably a better way to look at this is to acknowledge that we're going to suffer that, rather than to, because what we try to do is avoid that. Paul, that's right, we try to avoid it. Maybe we're just going to have to acknowledge that, yes, there's going to be an impact if we have such an event in the future, and it will probably involve a severe diminishment of health capability for a period, but we can do things to educate people about that in advance if we plan that way, rather than plan in a way which says, well, we'll do anything at all to make sure that no one gets admitted to hospital without this. I'm being extreme here, but so.
I might just add that there are many other things that we can do other than going to hospital or using the healthcare service to keep ourselves healthy. I mentioned this at the start, promoting our immunity, eating right, sleeping well, drinking plenty of water, going out and enjoying time with friends, being outside, getting some vitamin D. All of these things are good ideas, and the more we do them, the healthier our population, the less we need that extra funding. And I'll just be the dismal economist for one moment. An economist always looks at all the different possible places we could spend the next public dollar and says, where am I going to get the highest return? I am not convinced that the highest return is giving an extra dollar to the health system. And there's a lot of other places that also need it. And so what should be done from my perspective is, as an economist, to look at all of the possible ways we could promote human well-being. That's including mental health support, physical health support, but also just simple things like infrastructure, educational improvements, anything that the government spends money on, and ask really what is the return on that investment. And if it's not high enough in terms of human well-being creation and promotion, then it shouldn't get the next dollar.
Thank you. So I think we had questions coming in by SMS and email, and I'm going to ask Georgie if she could read at least the first one, and then we might take another one after that too.
Hi, yes, certainly. We've had lots of questions, so thank you to everyone that sent them in. But I have a question from Shahar Amiri, who says, many of the proposals tonight have been technocratic in tone. If only we could tweak this or that policy or institution, it would be different next time. But fundamentally, the biggest calls have all been taken by political leaders at federal and state levels. How should we rethink our democracy to ensure a better response next time?
So, Gigi, I think you started down this course, but do you want to add to what you've already said?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to the comment that many of the solutions sound technocratic. They sound like more of the command and control, more of we need to figure it out and have the right people in the room, and so it gets figured out the best, and then push out the knowledge to all the masses, right? I don't fundamentally like that model. I think that is a model of more of autocracy than of democracy. Right? The model that we should be following, I think, is much more to do with trusting that markets of people, not just economic markets, but marketplaces of ideas, markets of communities just exchanging information with each other. They are very powerful, and they know often what is best for them. They are the ones at the coalface who have the signals of what's going to work, what's not going to work. And for some centralized people with a secure job, looking at their laptops to make decisions on behalf of all of Australia about the kinds of things that they've made decisions about during this period is wholly inappropriate. So I think we've just had a pendulum swing way out in the direction of government overreach. And we're still seeing some of that mentality in some of the conversation tonight, I think, that somehow that, the solutions lie in just better overreach. Overreach, but better, right? No, we need to push the pendulum back away from government. Just cut a lot of things that government is now doing. Stop with the bureaucracy. Stop, just have the size of certain departments. Don't do some of the stuff that government is now doing. And trust that Australia is strong enough and its people are wise enough to be able to make a lot of the decisions that we may have been seduced into thinking that only the government can make, and have the government refocus on its core business. I think that would be a positive step towards trying to get back to a country in which people are actually empowered and are expected to take more responsibility for running their country, which is sort of what democracy is supposed to be about.
So, Paul, just to take that thought forward, do you think now, where it seems to me governments are saying people can make their own choices about what they do in terms of wearing masks and so on, do you think we're at the right point now in the direction that Gigi wants us to go?
Oh, look, it's a very complicated question, isn't it? I mean, I certainly, appreciate all of those points. I think, that when you're faced with a pandemic, though, I think there is still a role for expertise to a degree, and I think the overreach has to be considered, the diversity and inclusiveness of whose opinions are listened to, and the structure through which that's applied and implemented needs to be strongly considered. But I think, facing an unprecedented pandemic with a virus that's, killed tens of millions of people and has not been able to be eradicated, and for which we have quite complex interventions and mitigating strategies that need to be applied. I think there is a role for expertise. As I say, I don't think our country got it right, and I'm not advocating for lockdowns, but I think in terms of being able to educate and provide advice to people about whether it be masks, vaccination, antivirals, how to use those to get the fullest advantage. We need to come up with, groups to apply those to in a prioritised basis, because they're a finite resource, for example. And, I think while we have to appreciate the role of individuals and the population, we also need to, provide them with the right information and guidance so that we get the most benefit from some of those interventions. So, again, I don't think it's a simple answer, and, I think we need to do a lot better than we have done, but I think there's still a role for trying to provide people the right advice.
Thank you. Izzy, do you have a view about how the handling by political leaders can be improved? And then I'm going to ask Peter the same question.
I'm thinking through particularly Gigi's points, and I appreciate them a lot. I think about myself a couple of years ago, and if I was called onto a jury I'm an educated young person. I've gone through school and the most part of my uni degree. I don't know if I would have been in a position to make an informed decision, though, about perhaps someone who's going to be in a very powerful position, purely because I didn't, and I still don't completely understand all of the structures and all of the complications of this society we live in. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a role, everything always comes back to education, but I wish I had learnt more through my school years about this world that we live in, so that I could be that sort of person that is able to provide a really well-informed, thoughtful opinion when it comes to these leaders.
So 2 points. Point one, I agree with you. Your education system probably has failed you. I think in general the Australian education system is not that great. But okay, I don't know what that person is saying. I can't understand it. The second point is, do you think anyone in Australia actually has achieved the mastery of our systems and societies and whatnot that you hold up as the golden chalice, the thing that must be achieved before we have the right to vote, basically, on something. I just don't think anybody does, right? We are living in a dynamic, complex, chaotic world, right? It's tough to understand everything. That's why you have multiple people on this jury, not just one. And people on criminal juries, generally speaking, work together well. They're just everyday people, but they work together well. They try hard. They weigh up evidence. Don't underestimate the power of people to actually do a good job when they know that something really important is on the line, and they have, you know, the state's resources to support their choice. They can interview whoever they want. They can get advice if they want to, but they don't have to. Nobody's telling them what to do. Just this person is going to be setting education policy for our state. Who should it be?
Okay.
Sorry, that's a really good point. One of, I think, my biggest learnings of the last couple of years has been that adults also have no idea what they're doing. And so I completely appreciate that point.
Well said. Peter, performance of political leaders.
Well, I guess it depends in terms of the questioner's statement. I mean, didn't like technocratic solutions. Well, either we're going to plan or we're not going to plan. So, you know, maybe if you're an advocate for let's not plan anything and let's just all let it happen, well, I guess you can have your own say on that. But I wouldn't actually agree with the going in proposition. This is a technocratic discussion. In fact, it seems to me far removed from a technocratic discussion. In terms of political kind of systemic reforms here, at the end of the day, if you are advocates for a citizen-centric decision-making, there's still an implementation phase, or a non-implementation phase, but there's still a phase to come after that. And so people for advocates, this would need to recognise that it's either a politician then who orders the decision or the non-decision to take place, or it's an even more monumental change, and doing that at a time of crisis is going to be, I would suggest, highly problematic. So I'm not saying shouldn't have this engagement. I'm actually pretty much an advocate for broader engagement, as I've said earlier. But everything in a crisis requires ultimately a decision to be either implemented, or if it's a decision to do nothing, still that's an implementation, because then it becomes a communication issue. How do you tell people we've decided to do nothing? Anyway, difficult.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our allocated time, so let me just conclude by trying to draw out some areas where I think there may be at least a measure of agreement amongst our panellists. I certainly don't intend to summarise our discussion this evening. And at the risk of picking out some themes that may seem a bit technocratic, but I actually think go to the heart of many of the things we've discussed. So if we're thinking about how do we approach this next time, I think we're probably all agreed that the basis on which decisions were taken was far too narrow. And that narrowness shaped decisions which didn't reflect the sort of range of trade-offs that need to be made in relation to different interests and the way it affected different parts of the community. I think the need to avoid extremes is something that we could probably all agree on. Although how far we go in avoiding extremes, there may be different views on. We didn't talk much about this, but I think transparency of advice is, well, I think it's vital in any democracy that people understand the basis on which decisions are made, and the great benefit of making advice more transparent is that it is open to debate and to contestation, which is important for policy making. I think it's important to stick to plans. I mean, I found it surprising that whatever pandemic management plans existed prior to 2020 were basically completely ignored. And one of the recommendations in the review that Izzy and I participated in was to practice crisis response frequently off the basis of a well-established plan. So I think, and I think Peter's points about, let's not reach for a command and control model as the first response is also something we could probably all agree on. So I just want to conclude by thanking all of our panel members. Thank you for making your case clearly and for the conviction with which you articulated your position. I think you have given us a better feel for the complexity of the issue, even if the answers aren't always going to be obvious. And I also want to thank Murray Hancock and his team for putting this dialogue together. I mean, it's a labour of love on their part. They're very much driven by the intrinsic value of civil discussion, debate that is forensic and robust, but which can also lead to finding some common ground. And I commend Murray and his colleagues for that. So I'll conclude by returning it to Christy.
Before I close off the night, I just want to set something straight as well. Virus or a disease, COVID-19? Isabel? What?
Well, I guess it's a disease caused by a virus.
That's right, okay. Just noticed there was a bit of different terminology. Very thought-provoking discussion tonight. So in the interest of time, we want to thank everyone for their time. Gigi for her tireless work over the past 2.5 years to bring an alternative policy perspective to pandemic policy, and for being our first repeat Big Dialogue panellist. Thank you, Gigi. Paul for taking time off his gruelling clinical and research schedule to share his practical wisdom from the lab and the front line. Thank you, Paul. Peter Harris for coming down from the heights of international finance back to his hometown to give us the benefit of his vast experience in government. Isabel for flying up from Adelaide straight after exams to inject a well-informed, youthful perspective and voice instead of partying.
That happened.
And finally, Peter Varghese for somehow finding the time for this event, including considerable preparation for it, and finding the single most important ingredient to what TBD does: excellent moderation of difficult discussions. Let's show our appreciation in the usual manner. Now, finally, everyone, please consider getting involved or just donate to TBD's mission to foster the genuine, across-the-aisle dialogue which is essential to a healthy democracy. A final plug for Dialogues at School, which has exciting potential to make a big impact nationally, with funding of around $200,000 needed to do well and realise that potential next year. So donations are welcome at brisbanedialogues.org. Please send offers of support, introductions, suggestions and questions to the Brisbane Dialogues at gmail.com. And just remember, Gigi's second book is at the back, as well as Locked Out by Meredith, who is in the audience tonight, so please check those out. If you want to watch the discussion again, it will be posted on YouTube. And thanks again, everyone, for your contribution tonight. Please carry on the discussion at home, work, and with friends. And if you need a drink, the bar is open for a while yet.